In everything there is a season. Some seasons are longer than our lifespan, and thus we do not recognize them as such. Some are brief and we hardly notice their existence. With God, there is an order and a precision to every season of our lives. So let's look at Daniel chapter 5 and watch summer turn to fall. Now, oh, what a party. So we're going to start with Daniel 5:1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then he brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. What a party. I told you last week to pay attention when we were looking at Daniel 1, and it said they took the vessels from the Lord's house. These were the vessels that were part of like the tabernacle experience. These were the vessels that were the holy vessels for the the cup and the different ceremonial cleansings and things that went on in the temple. These were those vessels. They were special. They were set aside. They'd been built to God's specifications, if you will. And so they were taken by Nebuchadnezzar. They were brought. And so now Belshazzar has this great feast, and he was a little full of himself anyway. But he's having, he throws the best party. So he's having a great party, and he's got a little wine in him. And he decides, hey, let's get the vessels that my dad stole from the Jewish guys here. Let's grab those and bring them over, and let's use those and do a really big toast and stuff. Sometimes the place settings matter. Sometimes how you use the things and what you use matters. My parents, and they taught me this, were always good about setting things aside, consecrating things, and giving them back to God. We do dedication services where we dedicate our child to the Lord, and we do that process, and we dedicated to God. Well, that's a big deal. But they were big on dedicating other things, cars and houses and things that they had. God, this is dedicated to you. It's for your use. It's for your purposes. It's yours. And so Belshazzar takes the thing that's been dedicated to God, and he uses it for his own purposes. He uses it for his own drunken party. And they're toasting everything except God. They're toasting their gods of gold and silver, of wealth and of wood, and all these different, they're toasting all these different gods. They didn't invite the King of Kings. They were using his place settings, but they didn't invite him. You got to watch the guest list. Verse 5 says, in the same hour, what hour? The hour that they're toasting and doing all this stuff. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall on the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. I guess he crashed the party. And it says that the king's countenance was changed and his thoughts troubled him. In other words, he saw this hand coming right on the wall and it was disturbing to him. Maybe he understood, and I do believe he understood, what he had done to take the holy vessels that had been set aside for the worship of God, and he had turned it into just a party, a drunken party. He had taken what had a purpose and had a set aside purpose, and he had totally gone against that. And it troubled him. It bothered him. And he was so, it says it was so troubled that the joints of his loins were loosed and his knees smote one against another. That's, basically he was shaken. Right? It upset him badly. I mean, maybe if you realized you hadn't invited the King of Kings to a party and you'd kind of done some stuff that upset him and his hand showed up and wrote on your wall, it might upset you a little bit too. Definitely worked on him. It says his countenance was changed. And so he asked to bring in all of his astrologers and his magicians and his, those that could, soothsayers and all these, so that they could see what was going on. And he said, look, I'm going to make you really well off if you can tell me what this sign says. If you can tell me what's been written here. Why? Because he knew he'd upset somebody. But he was trying to figure out just exactly what had gone on. Now remember when we talked last week about Daniel, it said that he was given special wisdom here. Where from? From God. It also said that when they were testing to see how the Jewish boys did against their own people, the ones that had set themselves aside and not eaten the king's meat and stuff, that they were 10 times better. So he calls for his people, and they come, and they can't give him the meaning thereof. They can't tell him what this means. He's telling him, you'll be the third ruler in the kingdom. But it says that they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. And he was really upset. And then someone says, hey, there's a guy in the kingdom that could probably figure this out. He has great wisdom. And your father knew that he had this wisdom. And so they call for Daniel. And Daniel's brought before the king, and the king speaks to Daniel, and he says, are you that Daniel which are the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men and the astrologers have been brought in before me, and they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not do so. I'm paraphrasing slightly. And it goes on, Daniel answers and says, King, let your gifts be to yourself. So I don't need to be third ruler in the kingdom. I don't need a scarlet robe or any of that stuff. You just keep it. You give that to somebody else. But I'll read the writing and I'll make known the interpretation. Now, you can say, well, that's kind of bold on Daniel's part. But I want you to stay tied into the theme that we started talking about last week, which is God provided what Daniel needed. God gave Daniel special wisdom in this area. Daniel had set himself aside and apart. God had given him everything he needed. Daniel knew that what he needed came from God. So just like when he said, test us after 10 days and see if we're doing as good with the food that we're eating instead of the food you want to feed us. It's the same thing. He's like, I don't need your gifts. I'm going to tell you what it says. And then Daniel does a little bit of a history lesson for Belshazzar. He tells him about his father, the king, and how God had to humble him. And then he comes to the crux of the matter, which he says, to Belshazzar, he says, you're not humbled. Even though you know all these things, you're not humbled. Even though you understand all, you have been haughty. You have been prideful. That's why you went and did the thing with the cups and stuff, is because you were being prideful. He doesn't say it that way, but that's what he means. And, the Bible tells us pride comes before a fall. And I, we just have come through an election period, and one of the things that I can tell you for sure is this: for the most part, politicians are prideful. For the most part, they like to hear their own voice. They like to see their name in lights. They like to put their name on things. They like, for the most part. Are there exceptions? Yes. When you look at a lot of what we call success in the world, you see people who are very prideful. They want to put out there how great they are, how good they are, and yet the Bible clearly tells us that we need to pay attention to who is the source of our help. Daniel's relying on God. He's telling the king, hey, you're out of line here. And Daniel had to know a little bit of what was going on right here, because to speak to the king in the way that he is without having some knowledge of what God was going to do would have been a really foolish thing. You have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And now and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and hast praised the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and not the God in whose hand thy breath is in, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. I love the phrase, and I've talked about it many times. I love the phrase, and the God in whose hand thy breath is in. That puts it all in perspective. It is God who is controlling everything. It is God who is the source of all life. It is God who has your very next breath in his hand. And he's telling him, you haven't paid attention to him. That's the guy you didn't invite to the party. They can't read these signs. They don't know what they say. And he goes on and says, then was the part of the hand sent from him, and his writing was written. And starting at verse 25, and this is the writing that was written. Mene, tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given unto the Medes and the Persians. There's several things, and we could spend a whole week just talking about those three verses. I'm going to try not to do that. But I've said this before. What it basically said is, you have been weighed in the balances and been found to have no weight. You're of no consequence. You have no gravitas. That's an old election term. I just thought I'd throw that out there. But he says basically, you've been weighed and there's nothing. You don't even move the scale. So you might think you're all that in a bag of potato chips, king, but you can't even move the scale with God. Okay? Now, these are weighty words, literally. Because one of the things that they talk about with these words is this. Each of these words is a word that has a tie to a unit of measure, to a Jewish unit of measure. Mene, tekel, upharsin. These all have meaning to weight. Okay? Now, the picture that you get, I think, is the balances, the two scales, right? And it's basically, okay, here's God, and then we put you on there, and oh, look, it didn't move at all. Okay? But if you take these words, there's several different pieces I want to pull out for you here today. If you take these words and you take their values and add them up, you end up with 2,520. 2,520. Daniel is a book that talks about events that happened in Daniel's time, but they talk about heavenly events and they talk about future events. And the book of Daniel is tied very closely to the book of Ezekiel and to the book of Revelation in looking at the end times. There's pieces and parts that you have to kind of cross-reference if you're really going to study it out. So how might this affect our today, this weird number, this 2,520? Well, understand that if you look at the tribulation, and that 7-year period of time, and you break it down and you break it into its parts, you'll find that you have two pieces of 1,260 days. And if you take 1260 and 1260, you get 2520. Now, why am I saying that? I just want you to see that God has an order to things. God has a plan for things. God has an understanding of things. In Daniel 1, it says he allowed this captivity to take place. It says they took the vessels and they took them, Nebuchadnezzar took them and put them in their temples. It says that when his son then desecrated those things, he came and wrote on the wall. And what he wrote on the wall talked about weight, talked about him having no effect, him being of no weight. He throws in this discussion of weight, and if you add it up, it comes out to 2520. Daniel talks about future events in the 70 weeks and all these different pieces and parts. And I just think that it's interesting when we look and we see the orchestration and the detail that God is capable of doing. We can trust that God knows what he's doing in 2020. We can trust that God has it figured out very precisely. And in fact, a couple other things I want to mention to you. It says, many tekel aparesian. And then when Daniel talks about it, he says, many tekel perez. Okay? And it's because something has changed. And I've talked about this before too. But when the words are written, it says that you've been weighed in the balances and you're found wanting, and your kingdom will be divided. And in fact, Babylon was divided between the Medes and the Persians, the two sides to the scale, if you will. And so when Daniel interprets it and reads it back to him and gets to that last part, he says the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. In other words, the interpretation that Daniel gives has already taken place, because literally as they're doing this, something is taking place. Babylon, the great city that could not be brought down, is in fact falling. Babylon that had these great walls and you were not going to be able to attack Babylon and succeed, had the river running through the city. And what the Medes and the Persians did is they dammed up the water, stopped the river from flowing, and they came under the walls in the riverbeds and took the city. See, it had already been divided. The king hadn't got the final notice, I guess, but it had already been divided. And it says, then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. What he said he would do if he could interpret this. But then it goes on, it says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. His kingdom was divided. His life was over. It was the end. He had done wrong. He had done this thing that was just basically an abomination to God. And if we go on and read, you'll find that Daniel again rises to the top. Again, rises to a position of authority. See, rising to the top, transition is easy when you're with the King of Kings. This king thought he could give Daniel something. I'll make you third in command. Daniel's like, I don't need that. You're not going to be around long enough. He's on to another, Daniel, again, over and over goes through this thing where he rises to the top. Why? Because he's tied to God, because he's set himself aside for God's service, not for man's service. You know, if you want to know how not to have fear, tie yourself to God. Tie yourself to existence. Tie yourself to peace. Well, if things get really bad, I don't know how I'm going to be able to buy food. Well, we talked about manna a couple of weeks ago. What's this? God's food. But why are you worried about life when you're tied to existence? Why are you fearful when you're tied to peace? If you need to spend some time talking to God and getting it worked out and getting it right, do so. But tie yourself to the right king. What is the fear that we are looking at today? And it's really the fear of the unknown, isn't it? It's, I don't know what's going to happen. All these things changing, all the stuff that goes on, I don't know what's going to happen. And what's the cause of that? Well, it comes down to the interpretation. It comes down to whether or not you can understand the signs that God's giving you. It comes down to whether or not you're paying attention. These words should have been known to all the soothsayers and all the wise men of the Chaldeans because they were skilled in many languages. And there's conjecture that, well, maybe it was the way they were written or the letters that they used. Maybe they were Hebrew letters and they didn't recognize them, which is kind of a stretch if they're really skilled in multiple languages. Maybe it was just simply they didn't understand what they meant. Like, well, what are these weights? That makes no sense. But see, Daniel had the answer because God gave it to him. How do we overcome this fear of the unknown? How do we overcome this fear of not understanding what's going on? Well, I'll tell you, it's really simple. Get to know the author. Get to know the one whose hand is writing on the wall. Get a relationship with him. And why does that even matter? Well, because what we're looking for is stability in changing times. We're looking for that stability. We're looking for something we can anchor ourselves to. And I got to tell you, no matter how hard you try, there's only one place you can go and get what you need, and that's Jesus Christ. Our prayer today says, Father God, I ask you to quiet my heart and mind. Let me see your hand moving in my daily life. Help me to let go of my anxiety and embrace your assurance. Grant me peace today. Amen. Here's the thing. We watch in this story as Belshazzar is in the summer, he's having the party, and all of a sudden he faces the fall, literally, and it's over. We don't have to fear when we're tied to Jesus Christ because we have eternal life. That's our promise. We can have peace. And there is a season for everything. But when we're tied to the one who controls the seasons, we don't have to worry anymore. And that's it for this week.